The frozen encounter. The icy wind howled across the frozen wasteland. Snowflakes swirled in the air, cutting through the silence of the dead planet. Jake Carter, the lone human explorer, moved carefully through the snow, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. His breath turned to mist as he exhaled, his thermal suit barely protecting him from the brutal cold. He checked his scanner. Nothing. Damn, no resources here either, he muttered to himself. Jake had been on this planet, Exo-9, for 3 days, searching for minerals and fuel. His ship was parked miles away, and if he didn't find something useful soon, he would have to leave empty-handed. Then, his scanner beeped. A faint life sign appeared on the screen. It was weak, almost dead. Jake's heart pounded. No life should exist in this freezing wasteland. He adjusted his visor and followed the signal, moving fast. The wind pushed against him, almost knocking him off balance, but he kept going. As he got closer, he saw something in the snow, a small shape buried beneath layers of ice. Jake dropped to his knees and started digging with his gloved hands. The ice was thick, but his fingers worked fast. After a few minutes, he uncovered a body. It was a girl, but not human. Her skin was pale blue, her hair white like snow. She wore a torn silver suit, covered in frost. Her lips were slightly parted, and her breath was faint, barely there. She was dying. Jake cursed under his breath. He knew he didn't have much time. The temperature was too low. If he didn't act fast, she wouldn't make it. His first instinct was to wrap her in his survival blanket, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Her body was too cold. The only way to warm her up was direct body heat. It was a crazy idea. But Jake had been a soldier once. He knew how to keep a dying person alive in extreme conditions. He had to do this. Without hesitation, Jake unzipped the top layer of his thermal suit and pulled the frozen girl into his arms. Her body was ice cold, like touching a frozen quartz. He wrapped the survival blanket around them both and held her close, rubbing her back to create warmth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she shivered. A sign of life. A small one, but a sign. "Come on, don't die on me," Jake whispered. The storm was getting worse. He had to move. Now, carefully, he lifted her onto his back, securing her with his arm. She was light, fragile, like she had no strength left. With the wind roaring around him, Jake started walking toward his shelter, his boots sinking deep into the snow. Every step felt like a battle. The cold bit into his face, and the weight of the girl on his back made it harder. Halfway there, his foot slipped. He fell hard, his body hitting the ice. The girl slid off his back, rolling a few feet away. Jake groaned, forcing himself up. He crawled toward her and checked her pulse. Still weak, but there. The storm was getting worse. If they stayed out here much longer, they would both die. Gritting his teeth, Jake picked her up again. This time, he held her close to his chest, covering her as much as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw the entrance to his shelter. It was a small survival pod, barely big enough for one person, but it had heat, food, and oxygen. Jake reached the door and punched in the access code. The metal hatch hissed open, and warm air rushed out. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing hard. His fingers were numb, his legs felt like stone, but they were alive. He moved fast, placing the girl near the heater. The warmth spread through the small room, melting the ice from her body. Jake grabbed a med kit and checked her vitals. She was still alive, but barely. He injected her with a small dose of stim fluid, something to help her body fight the cold shock. Minutes passed. Then, her fingers twitched. Jake leaned closer. "Hey, can you hear me?" Slowly, her eyes fluttered open. They were a deep violet, glowing faintly in the dim light. For a second, she just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, In a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "You saved me." Her accent was strange, her words slow, but Jake understood. He sighed in relief. "Yeah, looks like I did." But before he could say more, his scanner beeped again. Jake frowned. He picked it up, checking the readings. A new signal. Movement, something, or someone, was out there. And they were coming this way. Escape from the storm. The wind screamed. Outside, the storm was a monster. Snow and ice slammed against the shelter's metal walls, trying to break in. Inside, the air was warm, but tension hung heavy. Jake Carter crouched next to the alien girl, watching as her chest rose and fell. Slow but steady, she was alive. That should have been good news, but his scanner told a different story. Something was moving outside. Jake tightened his grip on his sidearm. His breath was steady, his instincts sharp. He had survived wars, frozen wastelands, and deep space disasters. But this was new. A weak voice broke his thoughts. "Where am I?" Jake turned. The girl's violet eyes flickered open again. She looked at him, dazed, confused. "You're safe," he said, "for now." She tried to sit up but winced. Her body was still weak, her movements sluggish. Jake grabbed a thermal blanket and wrapped it around her. "Don't move too much. You were almost frozen solid out there." Her gaze flickered to the scanner in his hand. She frowned. "Something is coming." Jake nodded. "Yeah. And I don't think it's friendly." He stood and walked to the small reinforced window. Through the storm's fury, he could barely make out shapes in the distance, shadows moving against the white void. Too big to be natural, too fast to be part of the storm. Jake's gut twisted. Predators. Locals? Something worse. He turned back to the girl. "Can you fight?" She hesitated. "Not yet." "Great," Jake sighed, already forming a plan. The chase begins. The storm raged, but the scanners didn't lie. The figures outside were getting closer. Jake had two options. Stay in the shelter and wait. Bad idea if whatever was outside could break in. Run for his ship. Also a bad idea, but at least it gave them a chance. He picked the second option. "We need to move," he said, grabbing his gear. "Can you walk?" The girl tried again. This time, she pushed through the pain, her legs shaky but holding. Jake nodded. Good enough. He secured his thermal suit and wrapped an extra survival cloak around her. Then he opened a small crate near the door. 2 flare charges, 1 plasma cutter, and a handful of mini explosives. Not much, but better than nothing. He handed her a small energy beacon. "If we get separated, press this. It'll guide me back to you." She took it, her fingers trembling slightly. "I don't even know your name." "Jake." She nodded. "Lyrian." No time for more talk. Jake took a deep breath and slammed the door release. The cold punched him like a sledgehammer. Wind roared. Snow lashed at his visor. The world was nothing but white and ice. "Stay close," he shouted over the storm. Lyrian gripped his arm as they pushed forward, every step a battle against the freezing winds. Behind them, the shadows moved closer. And then, a deep, inhuman screech cut through the storm. Jake whipped around just in time to see a massive shape lunge at them from the blizzard. Dark armor, clawed hands, eyes that burned like embers. Not an animal, not a local. A hunter. Hunted in the snow. The hunter struck fast. Jake barely had time to react. He grabbed Lyrian and rolled to the side, just as a massive clawed hand slammed into the ground where they had been standing. Ice cracked from the impact. Jake came up fast, pulling his pistol. He fired. 3 shots, but the bullets sparked uselessly off the hunter's armor. "Damn it!" The creature growled, a low, rumbling sound that felt more like a warning than a threat. Lyrian stumbled backward, her breath quickening. Fear flashed in her eyes. Jake stepped between her and the hunter. No way was he letting this thing take her. The hunter tilted its head, watching them. Then, in a voice like grinding stone, it spoke. "Human, step aside." Jake didn't move. Not happening. The hunter exhaled, white vapor escaping its mask. "She does not belong to you." Jake tightened his grip on his pistol. "She doesn't belong to anyone." The hunter's claws flexed. The storm raged. Then, it charged. Jake had no time to think. He grabbed one of his mini explosives and threw it straight at the ground. Boom! The explosion sent ice and snow flying, creating a temporary smoke screen. "Run!" Jake yelled. Lyrian didn't hesitate. They bolted through the snow, pushing their bodies to the limit. Behind them, the hunter roared. More shadows appeared in the storm. There wasn't just one. There were more. Jake clenched his teeth. This just keeps getting better. The hunt was on. And they were the prey. The alien truth. The storm swallowed everything. Snow and ice blasted against Jake Carter's visor as he ran, half carrying Lyrian through the blizzard. Behind them, the hunters moved like shadows, tall, armored, relentless. Their glowing eyes cut through the whiteout, tracking their every step. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They were playing with their prey. Jake knew this game. He'd seen it before, on the battlefields of Earth and the dead moons of Mars. Predators didn't rush. They let fear do the work for them. Not today. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, his mind racing. His ship was still too far. They needed a place to hide. A place to. His visor beeped. Structure detected, 200 meters ahead. Jake narrowed his eyes, trying to see through the storm. A dark shape loomed in the distance, half buried in ice. A wreck. "Lyrian, can you keep moving?" he asked, breathless. She was struggling to stay on her feet, her body still weak. But she nodded. I will try." "Good enough. Hang on." Jake pulled a grappling line from his belt, hooked it around his harness, and fired it at the wreck. The cable latched onto metal, giving them an anchor against the storm. "Hold on tight." With the wind threatening to rip them apart, Jake tightened his grip on Lyrian and reeled them toward the wreck. The hunters didn't chase. They watched. And that made Jake more nervous than anything. Inside the wreck, the hatch groaned as Jake forced it open. Stale air rushed out, cold, metallic, dead. He pulled Lyrian inside and slammed the door shut just as another inhuman screech echoed through the storm. Jake locked the door. Then he turned, scanning the room with his flashlight. Metal walls, scratched, dented, broken consoles, dim emergency lights flickering. This was an alien ship, but not just any ship. Lyrian's ship. She let out a sharp breath, her violet eyes wide. "No, this can't be real." Jake frowned. "You know this place." She moved forward slowly, her fingers trailing along the cold metal. "This was my ship, my crew. We were trying to escape when we crashed." Jake's gut tightened. Escape from what? She turned, her face pale. From them. The hunters. Jake exhaled sharply. "You want to tell me why they're after you?" Lyrian hesitated. Then she reached into her torn suit and pulled out a small glowing crystal. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Lyrian held it close to her chest. "It's why they won't stop hunting me. This is a star core." Jake blinked. "Sounds important." She gave a bitter laugh. "It's more than important. It's power. Enough to fuel entire planets. Enough to destroy them." Jake stared at the glowing crystal. "And you just have it?" Lyrian nodded. "I was the last one to escape with it. If the hunters get it, they'll use it to wipe out entire civilizations. My people tried to stop them. We failed." Jake let that sink in. "So," he said slowly, "you're telling me I just picked a fight with an unstoppable enemy over the most valuable thing in the galaxy." Lyrian gave him a weak smile. Pretty much. Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. Fantastic. Nowhere left to run. Jake's scanner beeped. His stomach twisted. The hunters were outside. Lyrian's eyes widened. They found us. Jake cursed under his breath. He needed a plan. Fast. He looked around. The wreck was dead, but maybe, just maybe, it still had some fight left. He turned to Lyrian. Does this ship have weapons? She shook her head. No power. Backup generators. Maybe, in the control room. Then we better get moving. They ran deeper into the wreck, their footsteps echoing. The ship groaned under the weight of ice, every shadow stretching like claws. Behind them, the metal hatch shuddered. The hunters were coming. Jake clenched his fists. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a war. The hunters arrive. The ship groaned like a dying beast. Metal creaked under the weight of ice, the broken hull trembling in the howling wind. Deep inside, Jake Carter and Lyrian moved through the wreckage, their footsteps crunching against frozen debris. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old machinery and decay clinging to every surface. Dim red lights flickered weakly, the last breath of a long-dead ship. Behind them, something slammed against the hatch. A deep, grinding noise. Jake knew that sound. Claws against metal. Lyrian's breathing was quick, her fingers tightening around the starcore hidden in her hands. They're here. Jake's jaw clenched. Yeah. And they're not knocking to say hello. Nowhere to run. They reached what was left of the control room, a shattered command deck covered in ice. Dead consoles lined the walls, their screens cracked, buttons frozen over. Lyrian moved fast, her fingers brushing over the controls. If we can restore minimal power, I might be able to activate. Boom. The ship shook violently. The sound of metal being torn apart sent chills through Jake's spine. Scratch that, he said, pulling his pistol. We're out of time. The hunters enter. The first hunter stepped through the breached hull. He was massive, 7 feet tall, armored in dark exoplating that shimmered in the dim light. His helmet was sleek, featureless except for 2 glowing red slits where his eyes should be. His movements were slow, controlled, a predator savoring the moment before the kill. 2 more followed behind him. The leader tilted his head slightly, scanning the room. Then, in a voice like a dying machine, he spoke. Give us the girl. Lyrian froze, her breath hitched, fear flashing in her violet eyes. Jake stepped in front of her. Yeah, see, that's not happening. The hunter's gaze shifted to him. As if finally noticing the human, he let out a low, gravelly exhale. A human. Weak. Insignificant. You cannot stop us. Jake smirked. Try me. The hunter lunged. The fight for survival. Jake moved fast, ducking just as the hunter's massive claws sliced through the air. The impact sent sparks flying as steel was torn apart where he had just been standing. Before the creature could turn, Jake fired 3 rounds into its armor. Nothing. The bullets bounced off harmlessly. Figures, Jake muttered. The second hunter charged from the side, its clawed hand swinging toward Lyrian. Jake grabbed an old metal pipe from the floor and rammed it into the hunter's leg. The impact did nothing to the armor, but it threw the creature off balance for 1 second. That was enough. Lyrian raised her hand, her palm glowing faintly. A pulse of blue energy shot from her fingers, striking the hunter in the chest. The creature staggered back, armor flickering with energy discharge. Jake's eyes widened. You didn't tell me you could do that. Lyrian looked just as shocked. I didn't know I could. Boom. The third hunter fired a weapon, a blast of molten plasma that exploded against the wall behind them. Jake grabbed Lyrian's wrist. We need to move. Now. They ran toward the back of the control room, where an emergency maintenance shaft led deeper into the ship. The hunters didn't chase. They were waiting. And that terrified Jake more than anything. The final stand. Jake and Lyrian slid down the maintenance shaft, landing hard on the lower level of the ship. The air here was colder, the walls covered in frost. Lyrian shivered, pressing the star core closer to her chest. "We can't keep running. They'll find us." Jake took a deep breath. He checked his ammo. Only one magazine left. Not that it mattered. Bullets weren't stopping those things. "We don't have to run," he said, his mind working fast. "We make our stand here." Lyrian looked up at him, confused. "How?" Jake glanced around. Old fuel tanks, fractured power conduits, explosive pressure valves. A slow grin spread across his face. "We'd blow them to hell." Lyrian's eyes widened. "You're insane." "Yep," Jake agreed, already setting charges. "But it's the only shot we've got." Above them, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the wreckage. The hunters were coming. Jake finished setting the last explosive, then turned to Lyrian. "When I say run, you run." She hesitated, looking at him. "And what about you?" Jake gave her a smirk. "I'll be right behind you." He was lying. But she didn't need to know that. Not yet. The final countdown. The first hunter dropped down into the lower level. Then the second. Then the third. They stood motionless, their glowing eyes locked on their prey. "Human," the leader growled. "You will not win." Jake pressed the detonator. "Guess again." Boom. The world exploded in fire and ice. The battle for survival. The fire and the fury. The world was fire. The explosion ripped through the wreckage, tearing metal apart like paper. Flames burst from the ruptured fuel tanks, a shockwave rolling through the frozen ship like an avalanche of heat and destruction. Jake Carter hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He barely had time to register the ringing in his ears before the blast wave threw him across the chamber, slamming his back into a jagged wall. His vision blurred. His body ached. But he was alive. For now. A groan escaped his lips as he forced himself to his knees. Smoke filled the air, mixing with the sharp scent of burning metal. The control deck above was completely gone, replaced by a smoking crater of debris and fire. Jake's gut twisted. "Lyrian." He turned, searching through the chaos. "Lyrian." For a terrifying second, there was no answer. Then, a cough. Through the smoke, a small figure stirred, half buried under a fallen beam. Jake moved before he could think, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He grabbed the metal beam and heaved. It barely budged. His muscles screamed, but he forced it up just enough for her to crawl free. Lyrian gasped, her face covered in soot, her violet eyes wide with pain and shock. Are they gone?" she whispered. Jake turned, scanning the wreckage. No movement, no sound. It had worked. They'd won. He exhaled, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Hell of a plan, huh?" Lyrian gave a weak chuckle. "Reckless. Dangerous. Stupid." She met his gaze. "But it worked." Jake grinned, shaking his head. Damn right it did. For a moment, just a moment, relief washed over them. Then, the shadows moved. The hunter that would not die. From the heart of the fire, a silhouette rose, armor blackened but unbroken. A hunter stepped forward, his exoplating cracked but still functional. Smoke curled off his body, his red eyes burning brighter than before. He had survived. Jake cursed under his breath. "Oh, come on." The hunter moved slowly, his steps controlled, deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He had won this fight before it began. "You resist," the hunter growled, his voice a low, inhuman snarl. "But resistance is futile." His gaze shifted to Lyrian. "Give me the star core, child. Your suffering will end." Lyrian's hands tightened around the crystal, fear flickering across her face. Jake stepped in front of her, rolling his shoulders. His body ached. He was down to one knife and half a clip. But if this bastard wanted her, he'd have to go through Jake first. Jake smirked, cracking his knuckles. "See, that's the thing," he said, shifting his stance. "You think you're the predator here." The hunter's head tilted slightly. "I am." Jake's grin widened. "Nah, you just haven't met a real human yet." The final fight. The hunter charge. Jake dodged left, just as a clawed hand swiped through the air, barely missing his throat. He spun, grabbing a metal pipe from the wreckage, and swung it with everything he had. Crack cake. The impact staggered the hunter for a fraction of a second. That was enough. Jake drove his last knife straight into the gap in the hunter's armor, right at the joint where metal met flesh. The hunter roared in pain. But he wasn't done. Before Jake could pull away, the hunter grabbed him by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Jake gasped, his vision blurring. The iron grip crushed his windpipe, his fingers clawing uselessly against the hunter's armor. The world faded at the edges. This was it. Then, the blinding blue light exploded in the chamber. Lyrian awakens. The hunter screamed, stumbling backward, dropping Jake as he clutched his chest, where the Starcore's energy burned against his armor. Jake hit the ground hard, sucking in a ragged breath. He turned toward Lyrian, her body glowing with an energy he hadn't seen before. Her hands pulsed with blue light, her eyes burning like twin stars. She wasn't afraid anymore. Lyrian stepped forward, her voice steady. "You want this power." She raised her hands and unleashed it. A pulse of raw energy erupted from her body, crashing into the hunter like a tidal wave. His armor cracked, split, and shattered, the force hurling him backward into the burning wreckage. For a moment, he struggled, his red eyes flickering. Then, he stopped moving. The glow in his eyes died. Silence. Jake exhaled, collapsing onto his back, staring at the dark ceiling above. "Remind me," he panted, "to never piss you off." Lyrian let out a shaky breath, her glow fading as she sank to her knees. "I didn't know I could do that." Jake let out a dry chuckle. "Well, good timing." They sat there, side by side, surrounded by the wreckage of their battle. Tired. Alive. For now. The aftermath. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Finally, Lyrian spoke. "What now?" Jake exhaled. "We get to my ship. We get the hell off this ice cube. Then, we figure out what's next." She looked at him. "You're not going to leave me." Jake scoffed. "After all this, not a chance, kid." A small, tired smile touched her lips. Outside, the storm began to clear. But Jake had the sinking feeling this fight was far from over. Because if these hunters were after Lyrian and the Starcore, who else was coming? A desperate escape. The ice graveyard. The storm had passed. The air was still cold, bone-deep, unforgiving. But the blizzard was gone. The sky above was dark, filled with swirling clouds and distant stars. Jake Carter stood on the wreckage of the ship, looking out over the frozen wasteland. The fires from the battle had died, leaving blackened metal and shattered ice in their place. The body of the last hunter lay motionless in the ruins. But Jake wasn't fooled. This wasn't over. Lyrian climbed up beside him, her breath misting in the freezing air. Her violet eyes reflected the faint starlight, exhaustion heavy in her expression. Jake exhaled, rubbing his sore ribs. "All right, kid. We're not sticking around for round 2. My ship's a few miles out. Can you walk?" Lyrian nodded, though her body swayed slightly. "I'll make it." Jake didn't believe her, but he didn't argue. They had to move. And fast. The warning signal. They had barely walked 100 meters when Jake's scanner beeped again. He frowned and checked the screen. Multiple signals. Not hunters. Something worse. His heart sank. Ah, hell. Lyrian tensed. "What is it?" Jake turned the scanner so she could see. A ship was approaching. A big one. And it wasn't friendly. Lyrian's face paled. "They called for backup." "Of course they did," Jake muttered. The wreckage site was no longer safe. If another ship landed, they'd be surrounded. They needed a new plan. Fast. Jake clenched his jaw. Okay, change of plans. Running's not gonna cut it. We need to get off-world. Lyrian looked at him, desperate. How? Your ship is still too far. Jake's eyes drifted back to the wreckage behind them. Maybe my ship is, he said. But yours isn't. Reactivating the dead ship. Lyrian's wreck was half buried in ice, its hull cracked, its engines dead. But the frame was still intact. If they could get some power running. Lyrian caught on fast. You want to restart it? Jake nodded. Yeah. Enough to send a distress signal, or if we're lucky, maybe even get off this rock. Lyrian hesitated. I don't know if it can fly. Jake smirked. Then it's a good thing I'm a damn good pilot. They sprinted back inside the wreck, climbing over twisted metal and stepping over frozen bodies of Lyrian's fallen crew. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Finally, they'd reached the engine room. Jake whistled low. Damn, this thing took a beating. The reactor was dead cold, its core cracked but not completely destroyed. Lyrian pressed a hand against the control panel. If we can reroute power from the auxiliary systems, it might be enough for one jump. Jake nodded. Then let's make it happen. He grabbed a toolkit from a wall locker and started working. Every second mattered. Outside, the scanner beeped again. The enemy ship was almost here. A race against time. Jake worked fast, reconnecting damaged fuel lines and reprogramming emergency circuits. Sparks flew as he forced a power bypass through the frozen conduits. Lyrian clutched the star core, her hands trembling. We don't have enough energy. Jake gritted his teeth. We do if we cheat. He pointed at the star core. Lyrian's eyes widened. You want to use this, just enough to jump-start the engines, Jake said. Can you control it? Lyrian swallowed hard. I can try. She closed her eyes, focusing. The star core flickered, pulsing with raw energy. Then, she reached out and pressed it against the ship's reactor. The ship shuddered. The lights flickered back to life. The engine hummed, weak, unstable, but alive. Jake whooped. That's what I'm talking about. Lyrian gasped, staggering back. I don't know how long it'll hold. Jake didn't wait. He grabbed her hand and dragged her toward the cockpit. Then let's not waste it. The final chase. They reached the bridge just as the enemy ship entered the atmosphere. Jake fell into the pilot's seat, flicking every switch he could. The ship groaned, metal grinding against itself, but the systems started responding. Lyrian dropped into the co-pilot's chair, her breathing ragged. Can you fly it? Jake grinned. I can fly anything. The engines roared to life. Outside, the enemy ship was descending fast. Massive, armored, predatory. Lyrian stared at the scanner, fear creeping into her voice. They're locking onto us. Jake cracked his knuckles. Then let's see if they can keep up. He punched the thrusters. The ship lurched forward, breaking free of the ice, kicking up a storm of snow and debris as it lifted off. The enemy ship fired. Jake rolled the ship hard left, dodging the blast by inches. Alarms blared. The hull was still weak, the engines barely holding together. They wouldn't survive another hit. Lyrian gripped the console. We need to jump. Jake scanned the nav systems. We're not at full power. We could rip ourselves apart. Lyrian looked at him, her voice steady. It's that or die here. Jake stared at the enemy ship closing in. Then, he made his choice. He slammed the emergency hyperdrive switch. The ship shook violently, light bending, gravity twisting. Then, boom, they were gone, drifting in the unknown. Silence. The hum of the ship was weak, but steady. They had jumped. But where? Jake exhaled, his hands trembling as he pulled away from the controls. Okay, that was close. Lyrian let out a breathless laugh. Clothes? That was insane. Jake turned to her. We're alive, aren't we? She smiled. Yeah, we are. But then, she looked at the star core in her hands, her expression darkening. Jake followed her gaze. They're not done hunting us, are they? Lyrian shook her head. No, they never will be. Jake sighed, leaning back. Well, guess that means we'll just have to stay one step ahead. Lyrian looked at him, something unreadable in her eyes. Jake, she said softly, you didn't have to save me. You could have left me behind. Jake chuckled, stretching his sore arms. Yeah, well, guess I'm just stubborn like that. She smiled. For the first time, it wasn't a sad one. The stars stretched out before them. Unknown, dangerous, but for the first time, they weren't alone. A warm goodbye, or a new beginning. Drifting through the unknown. The stars stretched endlessly before them. The ship drifted through the vast darkness of space, its engines barely holding together after the reckless escape. Inside, the air was thin, the systems weak, but it was quiet. A rare, fragile peace after the chaos they had just survived. Jake Carter leaned back in the pilot's seat, watching the stars shift through the cracked viewport. His body ached from bruises, burns, and exhaustion, but he was alive. So was Lyrian. That counted for something. Behind him, Lyrian sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring at the glowing star core in her hands. The blue light pulsed softly, casting strange shadows across her face. You're thinking too hard, Jake muttered, breaking the silence. Lyrian glanced at him. What? That look, Jake said, nodding toward her. The one people get when they realize their whole life just changed, and they don't know what to do next. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. You're not wrong. Silence settled between them again. Finally, Jake sighed. All right, let's figure out where the hell we are. He tapped at the controls, pulling up a star map. The screen flickered, then displayed an unfamiliar sector of space. Lyrian frowned. That's not where we were supposed to go. Jake scratched his chin. Great. We just jumped blindly into uncharted space. What could possibly go wrong? Lyrian looked out at the distant nebula and drifting asteroids. Her fingers tightened around the star core. They'll come after us, she whispered. No matter where we go. Jake glanced at her. Yeah, I figured that part out. She hesitated. Jake, you don't have to stay. You could drop me off somewhere safe. Go back to your life. Jake exhaled sharply. There it was. The choice. He could walk away. Go back to Earth. Forget about alien relics and death squads. But that wasn't him. Jake smirked. And miss all this excitement? Not a chance, kid. Lyrian blinked, surprise flickering across her face. You're serious. Jake leaned back, stretching. Lyrian, I just stole an alien ship, punched a hunter in the face, and nearly got us killed in a blind hyperspace jump. You really think I'm gonna stop now? She stared at him. Then, slowly, she smiled. For the first time, it wasn't filled with fear. It was real. A new destination. Jake brought up the nav systems, setting a course toward the nearest habitable planet. All right, he said. We need supplies. Fuel. A damn good meal that isn't freeze-dried ration bars. Lyrian chuckled. And after that? Jake grinned. After that, we see where the stars take us. Lyrian looked at the glowing star core in her hands, then back at him. All right, she said softly. Let's go. The engines hummed. The ship shuddered. Then, with a burst of light, they'd vanished into hyperspace. Together. And so, the legend began.